Before you close your eyes and drift into the shadows of sleep, take a second to like this video. It tells me you want more tales that creep under your skin. Leave a comment if something in the story gave you chills, or if you've ever heard 3 knocks in the night. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be darker, deeper, and waiting just for you. Sleep well, if you can. I had been working as a 911 operator for almost 5 years now, and the nights were usually quiet or at least predictable in their own eerie way. The job was stressful, but it gave me a strange sense of purpose. Every call was a chance to save a life or calm a terrified voice on the other end of the line. The dispatch center sat in a nondescript building on the edge of a small rural county where most emergencies were accidents or occasional break-ins. The monotony was broken only by the occasional panicked call and the constant buzzing of the radio traffic. I had settled into a rhythm that made those long night shifts bearable. I knew my coworkers, but we rarely talked much during the graveyard shift, except about the weather or the latest local news. I worked the night shift alone, which some might find lonely, but I liked the quiet. There was something almost hypnotic about the stillness of the world at night, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional beep from the radio or the ringing of the phones. The room was dim, illuminated mostly by the glow of the computer screens that tracked emergency units and call logs. It was just past midnight when it happened. I was sitting at my desk, sipping the lukewarm coffee I had forgotten to finish hours ago, when the line 3 indicator blinked sharply. I glanced over expecting another routine call, but there was no call waiting on the queue. The screen showed no incoming caller ID, no location data, nothing. It was odd, but not unheard of. Sometimes lines would light up without an actual call connecting, due to glitches in the system. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should answer or ignore it. I pressed the headset button and said, 911, what's your emergency? Silence. Then a faint static hiss filled my ears, followed by a whisper, so soft I barely caught it. The voice said, hello, my first name. I froze instantly. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was unmistakably human, but distant, distorted almost like a voice on a bad radio signal. It wasn't loud enough to be threatening, but it was eerie in the way it said my name. How did it know my name? I had never given my name out on any call. Dispatch numbers were anonymous and confidential. The caller ID was blank. My hand trembled slightly as I leaned forward to adjust the microphone, hoping I had misheard. Who is this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady but calm. There was a pause, then the whisper came again, clearer this time, but still chilling. You shouldn't be here tonight. Then the line went dead. Just static. I sat back, staring at the headset, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a prank call. Some kid with a voice changer, perhaps. But the fact it knew my name was unsettling. I tried to shake off the unease and called up the call logs to see if anything was recorded. Nothing. No call history, no ID. It was like the call never happened. I took a deep breath and tried to return to work, focusing on the radio chatter and the occasional dispatch requests. Still, the whisper echoed in my mind. Minutes passed, and the night remained quiet, eerily so. My mind kept drifting back to the call. Who was it? How did they know my name? Was it someone playing a twisted game? I tried to convince myself it was just a glitch or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then something else happened. My headset suddenly crackled with static, and a faint voice started speaking through the white noise. It was too garbled to understand at first. Then gradually I recognized it as a call from weeks ago. It was a frantic woman pleading for help. I remembered that call, the house fire on Elm Street. We lost the family that night. The woman was screaming for her children, the smoke thick and choking. I had tried to send help, but the fire spread too fast. Now, through the static, I could hear her again, her voice desperate and panicked. It was surreal, like a ghostly replay of a moment that haunted me still. The voice broke through the static, whispering, "Please don't let it happen again." My heart pounded. I scanned the system, but no call was actually coming through. It was just my headset picking up ghostly echoes. I felt the weight of guilt crush me. Those lost lives, the calls I couldn't save, the faces I couldn't forget. Then the silence returned. I rubbed my temples and tried to stay professional. The shift dragged on, the strange events unsettling me, but no more calls came. I decided not to tell anyone yet. I didn't want to seem paranoid or lose my job. But that night, sleep would not come easy. I lay awake thinking about the call, the voice that knew me, the voices from the past that refused to fade. Was it a warning? A haunting? Or just my own mind unraveling under the pressure? The next night I arrived early and tried to prepare myself for whatever might come. I checked all the systems, made sure my headset and radios worked fine. The night started quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of waiting for something to break the silence again. Then it did. Line 3 blinked once more. I stared at the screen, but again, no call log appeared. The line connected. The same distorted voice whispered my name again. This time, the voice was more urgent, more desperate. It spoke in riddles, mentioning places I had never been, events I had no knowledge of. Then it played back clips of my own voice from past calls, fragments of panic, sorrow, and helplessness. One clip was from a young girl who had called screaming that she was trapped in a burning house. I remembered the call vividly. She had died that night. Now her voice was begging me again. "Help me, please." I tried to trace the call, but the system was blank. It was like the voice was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My hands shook as I listened, trapped between reality and something else I couldn't explain. I felt a cold sweat break over me as I realized this was not a prank. Something else was using the emergency lines to reach me. Something tied to the dead, to the calls that ended in tragedy. As the night wore on, the voices grew louder, more frequent. I heard calls that never happened, cries for help from beyond the grave. The dispatcher's room felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories I couldn't escape. I stayed glued to my headset, waiting for the next call, wondering if I would answer or run. The line blinked again just before dawn. I pressed the button and whispered my name into the darkness, afraid to hear the answer. The days after that strange night passed in a blur of exhaustion and unease. I found it hard to focus at work, haunted by the memory of the distorted voice that called me by name and the ghostly echoes of desperate pleas from past tragedies. I kept telling myself it was just stress, maybe the result of too many long nights and too little sleep. But the feeling of being watched, of some unseen presence lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, refused to fade. I tried to keep my routine normal, arriving at the dispatch center on time, greeting my coworkers with forced smiles, and burying myself in the flood of calls that always seemed to pile up. Still, something was off. The radio channels, usually crackling with chatter, were strangely silent at times, then would burst into bursts of static or sudden calls that came through garbled and incomprehensible. One night, while I was trying to process a routine dispatch for a minor accident, my headset suddenly filled with a flood of voices, layered on top of each other fragments of calls from days, weeks, and even years ago. They overlapped in a cacophony of fear and pain, voices begging for help, crying out in terror, pleading for mercy. I recognized some of the voices immediately. There was a man trapped under a fallen tree, a woman screaming for her children as the flames consumed their home, a child whispering for her mother just before the line went dead. Each voice tugged at something deep inside me, dredging up memories I had long tried to forget. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to shut the voices out, but they only grew louder, clearer, more desperate. It felt like the past was bleeding into the present, that the walls of time were collapsing around me. I looked at the call logs, hoping to find some explanation, but the system showed no incoming calls during the moments the voices filled my headset. It was as if the dead themselves were reaching out through the lines, trapped between worlds, begging for a second chance. The next day, I confided in a trusted coworker, someone who had been with the dispatch center almost as long as I had. I told her about the calls, the voices, and the strange caller who knew my name. She listened carefully, her face going pale as I described the eerie details. "You need to be careful," she warned me. "There have been stories about this place, about the old dispatcher who died on the line years ago. Some say his spirit still haunts the system, trying to finish what he started." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss her words as superstition, but deep down I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, the Line 3 indicator blinked again. My heart raced as I hesitated before picking up the headset. The voice came through once more, distorted but unmistakable. This time, it spoke with a sense of urgency and familiarity that unsettled me deeply. The caller began recounting details about my own life things no one else knew. It mentioned my childhood fears, the accident that left a scar on my family, the late nights spent haunted by guilt over calls I couldn't save. The voice taunted me, reminding me of every mistake, every life lost on my watch. Then it played back a recording from one of my own calls, but the voice on the other end was crying for help again, begging me to save them. I realized with growing horror that the voice on the line was a warped echo of myself, a twisted reflection trapped in the system. Panic surged through me as the call ended abruptly, leaving behind only static and silence. I sat frozen, struggling to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Something beyond my understanding was reaching through the emergency lines, pulling me deeper into a nightmare. I spent the next few days researching the history of our dispatch center, desperate for answers. I discovered that the Line 3 number had been disconnected years ago, after the death of a dispatcher who suffered a fatal heart attack during a particularly stressful shift. His name was never spoken much, but rumors said he had been tormented by calls that never seemed to end, haunted by the screams of those he couldn't save. Some believed his spirit remained tied to the lines, trying to reach out for closure. I felt a cold connection to that story, as if the dead dispatcher's pain had somehow found its way to me. The nights grew darker, the voices louder, and the calls more frequent. Each time Line 3 blinked, I knew the nightmare was about to resume. I was caught between worlds, trapped in a liminal space where the living and the dead collided. I began to question my sanity. Was this real? Or was I losing my grip on reality after so many sleepless nights? But no matter how much I wanted to deny it, the voices kept coming. One night, the call came again. The voice on the line was clearer than ever, revealing secrets from my past I had never shared with anyone. It spoke of things I had buried deep inside, memories of a call where a child died despite my efforts. The voice blamed me, whispered accusations, and pleaded for forgiveness. I realized then that this was not just haunting or trickery. It was my own guilt, manifesting through the lines, seeking redemption or revenge. I knew I had to confront it. I prepared myself mentally for the next shift, hoping to find a way to end the torment. But when I arrived at work, the air was thick with tension. The usually bustling dispatch center was oddly silent. My coworkers exchanged worried glances but said little. That night, the final call came. Line 3 blinked. I answered, and on the other end was a voice trembling with fear, my own voice, crying, pleading, warning me not to answer the call, not to go to the house. It was a voice from the future, a desperate message from a self trapped in the same nightmare I now faced. As the line went dead, alarms blared, and the room filled with smoke. The screens flashed a chilling message. Call answered. I realized then that I was no longer just an operator. I was part of a story much darker than I ever imagined, caught in a cycle where the past and future collided, and the dead refused to rest. The question remained, would I be the one to break the cycle or become the next lost voice on line 3? After that night, nothing was the same anymore. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The image of my own terrified voice on the other end of line 3 haunted me relentlessly, replaying in my mind like a broken record. I became obsessed with understanding what was happening to me, searching desperately for a way out of the nightmare that was slowly consuming my sanity. Every time I sat at the dispatch console, I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, the heavy presence of something lurking just beyond my perception. The strange calls continued, but now they carried with them a deeper, more personal torment. The distorted voice that once simply whispered my name began to speak clearly, revealing intimate details about my life that no one should have known. It recounted memories I had never shared, moments of vulnerability and pain I had buried deep within myself. The voice mentioned my childhood fears, the accident that had broken my family, the late nights spent wrestling with guilt over lives lost on calls I couldn't save. It was as if the darkness inside me had taken shape, manifesting through the phone lines to punish me endlessly. One night, as I sat alone in the dispatch room, the air grew thick and heavy, the lights flickering intermittently. The line 3 indicator lit up again, and with trembling hands, I answered. The voice was clearer than ever, a chilling mixture of sorrow and anger. It told me about a call I had mishandled years ago, a call that ended in the death of a child. The voice recited the details of the call, word for word, playing back my own responses with a twisted echo. It accused me of failing, of letting innocence slip through my fingers. Tears streamed down my face as the voice begged for forgiveness, for someone to right the wrongs of the past. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped, caught in a cycle of pain and regret that refused to end. The voice then played a recording that was impossible to explain, a voice from the future, mine, warning me not to answer the call, not to go to a certain place. The message was fragmented and desperate, filled with fear I had never known before. I tried to trace the source, but the system offered no clues. It was as if the call came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Tears streamed down my face as the voice begged for forgiveness, for someone to right the wrongs of the past. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped, caught in a cycle of pain and regret that refused to end. The voice then played a recording that was impossible to explain, a voice from the future, mine, warning me not to answer the call, not to go to a certain place. The message was fragmented and desperate, filled with fear I had never known before. I tried to trace the source, but the system offered no clues. It was as if the call came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Days blurred into nights as I became consumed by this growing darkness. My coworkers noticed the change in me, how my eyes darted nervously, how I flinched at every sound. But I kept the truth to myself, afraid of being labeled insane or worse, fired. I searched for answers in the dispatch center's archives, desperate to uncover anything that might explain the supernatural occurrences. I found records of the old Line 3 number, disconnected years ago after the mysterious death of a previous dispatcher who had been haunted by the same kind of calls. The stories told of a man overwhelmed by guilt, driven to madness by the voices on the line. Some whispered that his spirit never left the building, bound forever to the emergency system, trying to warn others or exact revenge. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Was I destined to follow in his footsteps? To become another lost soul trapped in this purgatory of static and sorrow? The nightmares seeped into my waking hours. I saw shadows move where no one was, heard whispers just beyond hearing, and felt cold touches on my skin. One evening, after my shift ended, I returned home to find the same distorted voice waiting for me, on my answering machine. It played fragments of my own voice, begging for help, crying out from a place I could not reach. I destroyed the machine in a fit of rage and despair, but the calls continued. They found me everywhere in my dreams, in reflections, in the silence between heartbeats. I realized I had to confront the source of this terror. I returned to the cabin where the old dispatcher had died. The place was abandoned, its walls blackened by fire and neglect. Inside, I found an old headset, melted and broken, lying on the floor alongside a tattered call log. The log bore my name and a date stamped in the future, a warning that chilled me to the core. It was a message I had not yet received, but could not escape. The past, present, and future were tangled together in a nightmare I was living, and the voices of the lost were calling me home. That night, alone in the dispatch center, I prepared myself for the final call. The Line 3 light blinked steadily, a beacon in the darkness. I took a deep breath, grasped the headset, and answered. On the other end was my own voice, trembling and terrified, pleading with me not to go to the house, not to answer the call that would seal my fate. The voice warned of a trap, a snare set by forces beyond understanding. As the call ended, alarms blared through the room, lights flickered violently, and the screens flashed the words. Call answered. I felt myself slipping away, fading into the static and silence, becoming part of the story I had tried so desperately to escape. The last thing I heard was my own voice, whispering a warning from the future. Too late. It's already here. After that harrowing night, the line between my reality and the shadows haunting me dissolved completely. The dispatch center, once a place of order and calm professionalism, had become a prison filled with whispers, shadows, and echoes from another realm. Every night as I sat at my station, waiting for the inevitable blinking of Line 3, I felt the weight of unseen eyes bearing down on me. The voices that had once been occasional became relentless, gnawing at my mind, eroding my sanity piece by piece. The call from my future self, the terrified, desperate voice pleading for me to stop, played endlessly in my head, a warning I could neither ignore nor fully understand. I knew the truth was buried somewhere beneath the layers of static and spectral echoes, but finding it felt impossible. Driven by a mixture of fear, guilt, and a desperate need for answers, I began to investigate the past of our dispatch center, and more specifically, Line 3, digging through archives, old call logs, and faded newspaper clippings. I uncovered the story of the dispatcher who had died on duty years ago. His name was Tom Harris, a man who had devoted his life to answering calls and comforting those in crisis. According to the records, Tom suffered a fatal heart attack during a night shift after receiving a distressing call from a young girl trapped in a fire. The event devastated the department and haunted those who knew him. The official reports mentioned nothing supernatural, but whispers in the local community spoke of strange occurrences at the center after his death. Radios would crackle with unexplained noises. Phantom calls would come through dead lines, and some said they heard Tom's voice echoing faintly through the night air. The parallels to my own experiences were chilling. I wondered if the guilt I carried was somehow linked to Tom's fate, as if the darkness that claimed him was reaching for me as well. One evening, compelled by a restless urgency, I decided to visit the site of that final call, the old cabin where the young girl had perished in the fire. The place had long since been abandoned, the charred remains standing as a silent monument to tragedy. The night was cold, and still as I approached the ruins, the moon casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me like ghostly fingers. Inside the scorched walls, I found remnants of the past, melted fragments of toys, scorched photographs, and to my shock, an old melted headset lying on the floor. Beside it was a tattered call log, yellowed and brittle with age. The log contained entries that no one else should have seen, calls that had never been logged officially, but were eerily familiar to me. My own name was scrawled across one page, with a date stamped in the future, a date that had yet to come but felt uncomfortably close. The message was a haunting reminder that time itself was unraveling around me, and that the nightmare I was trapped in was far from over. That night, back at the dispatch center, I struggled to sleep, haunted by the images from the cabin and the sense that the past, present, and future were colliding. The next shift felt like walking into a trap. As I sat at my desk, the line 3 light blinked steadily, a beacon in the growing darkness. The voice on the other end was no longer distant or distorted. It was clear, urgent, and unmistakably my own. It cried out in terror, begging me not to answer the call, warning me of a snare set by forces beyond comprehension. The room grew cold, the air thickening with an oppressive presence. The radios crackled and hissed, broadcasting fragments of conversations that had never happened, screens frozen in time. Suddenly, alarms blared through the building, and the screens flashed a chilling message in bold red letters. Call answered. I felt my vision blur and my body grow heavy, as if being pulled into a void between worlds. My sense of self began to fade, dissolving into static and silence. In those final moments, I understood the horrifying truth. I was no longer just an operator, but a part of the ghostly network that connected the living and the dead, a conduit for lost souls trapped in an endless cycle of pain and regret. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was my own voice, whispering a warning from beyond. Too late. It's already here. When I came to, I was somewhere between waking and dreaming, caught in a liminal space filled with flickering images and distorted voices. The dispatch center was gone, replaced by a vast emptiness where echoes of past calls drifted like ghosts. I was trapped in a purgatory of static and sorrow, bound to the lines I had once answered. Days, weeks, or perhaps years passed. I could no longer tell. Time lost meaning in this spectral realm. I could hear distant voices calling out for help, and I knew that somewhere out there, others were trapped like me, caught in the same endless loop of unanswered calls and lost chances. Desperation gnawed at my mind as I searched for a way back to the living world, for a chance to break the cycle. Then one night, a faint light appeared in the distance, a flicker of hope. It was the line 3 indicator, blinking once more. Gathering the last of my fading strength, I reached for the headset. On the other end was a new voice, trembling with fear, but full of determination. It was someone like me, a new operator just beginning their journey into this dark world. I whispered a warning, the same plea I had once received, hoping to spare them the fate that had claimed me. The cycle continued, but somewhere within the endless static, a spark of resistance remained. I was no longer just a lost soul. I was a guardian, a warning, a voice from beyond. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change the story. The night of my final shift descended with an almost palpable weight, pressing down on me with an intensity that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The dispatch center, a place I had known as a second home for years, now felt alien cold, oppressive, and filled with shadows that seemed to move just beyond the corner of my vision. The usual hum of computers and radios was replaced by a deafening silence that wrapped itself around me like a suffocating shroud. The building seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold, and I was the reluctant prisoner trapped inside its walls. My coworkers, once my companions through countless long nights, were mysteriously absent, each having called in sick or failed to show up, leaving me utterly alone with the glowing monitors and blinking indicators that were my only company. I sat rigid at my desk, the chair cold against my skin, my fingers twitching nervously above the keyboard, eyes fixed on the ominous line 3 indicator. The light blinked steadily, like a heartbeat echoing in the darkness, pulling me closer to a fate I could neither escape nor deny. Every second that passed stretched into an eternity, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it would burst from my chest. The memories of every distorted call, every ghostly whisper, and every pleading voice I had heard over the past weeks crashed over me in a relentless tide of dread. Then, with a suddenness that jolted me upright, the line 3 indicator flared bright. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, reached out and gripped the headset, the cold plastic biting into my palm. I pressed the button to answer, my voice cracking as I whispered, 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, silence. Then the voice came my own voice, but broken, terrified, trembling with desperation, unlike anything I had ever heard from myself. It was pleading, warning me not to proceed, begging me not to answer the call, not to go to the house, not to fall into the trap I was only beginning to understand. The voice was fragmented, a desperate jumble of fear and urgency, telling me of a place where time and reality twisted and warped, a place where the past and present collided in a violent, unending loop of suffering. The air around me seemed to freeze as the voice revealed horrors beyond comprehension, lost souls, caught in a snare set by forces far older and darker than any human mind could fathom. Shadows grew long and menacing, crawling up the walls and creeping along the floor, twisting into grotesque shapes that whispered my name in voices filled with sorrow and rage. The room that had once been a safe space for saving lives had transformed into a nightmare realm where reality fractured and broke. The voice on the line continued, telling me that answering the call would bind me forever to this realm, that I would become just another lost soul, trapped in the endless cycle of cries for help that could never be answered. It warned of a house, the site of unspeakable tragedy, where time folded back on itself, and the living were lured into the clutches of the dead. It begged me to resist, to fight the pull of the lines, but I felt my will slipping away. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. The radios exploded with static, then shifted into a horrifying chorus of screams and whispers layered over each other in a chaotic symphony of despair. The air was alive with spectral energy, crackling and sparking like electricity as unseen forces clawed their way into the room. The monitors flickered wildly, displaying distorted images of charred faces frozen in agony, figures reaching out from burning homes, and shadowy forms writhing in eternal torment. The emergency alarms screamed to life, their piercing wails echoing through the empty halls like a siren announcing doom. The red flashing lights bathed the room in an apocalyptic glow, turning every surface into a sea of ominous crimson. Across all screens flashed the same chilling message in bold, unyielding letters. Call answered. Panic surged through me, a primal wave that threatened to drown every thought. I tried to pull the headset from my head, but it felt fused to my flesh, the cord tightening like a noose around my neck. The voices on the line crescendoed into a deafening roar that filled my mind, drowning out reality and replacing it with chaos and torment. My vision blurred, darkness creeping from the edges toward the center of my consciousness. I felt myself slipping away, losing grip on my body, my identity, and the world I once knew. In the depths of that abyss, a terrible clarity emerged. The nightmare was not some external force, but a manifestation of pain, guilt, and sorrow, woven into the fabric of the emergency lines themselves. I was no longer just an operator. I had become a vessel for the suffering souls trapped between life and death, a link in the endless chain of tragedy and loss. As the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard one final whisper, faint but unmistakable, my own voice, filled with regret and warning. Too late, ... it's already here. The flicker of the line 3 indicator was the last thing I saw before everything faded into a void where time ceased to exist. There was no sound, no light, only an endless silence stretching into infinity. I was lost within the haunted lines, my spirit entwined with the echoes of the past and the cries of the forgotten. The nightmare had claimed me, but within the shadows of that eternal night, a small spark of hope remained, an unyielding ember that whispered of the possibility that one day, someone might break the cycle and bring peace to the restless voices trapped in the darkness. Until then, I was bound to the lines, a guardian and prisoner alike, forever part of the story that began with a simple call on line 3. After that final night, the dispatch center fell eerily silent. My coworkers returned cautiously, whispering about the strange alarms and flickering screens, but no one could explain what had happened while I was alone. When they found the headset on my desk, still connected but cold to the touch, there was no sign of me anywhere. Days turned to weeks with no trace, and despite frantic searches and investigations, I had vanished without a clue. Rumors spread of a haunted Line 3, a cursed number that trapped those who answered it in a limbo between life and death. New operators whispered of phantom calls and ghostly voices on the line, and the stories grew into legends whispered in hushed tones during graveyard shifts. Somewhere, beyond the veil of the living world, I lingered, no longer just a man but a restless spirit bound to the emergency lines, caught between worlds, trying to warn others of the trap that claimed me. My last message, faint and distorted, echoed through the static like a desperate plea. Too late, it's already here. And so, the cycle continues, a chilling reminder that some calls should never be answered, and some voices are better left unheard.